Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. Today we are going to be discussing how to end the war on drugs. This is a long overdue topic that we've been cooking up for a couple of months already because there has been a recent event in New York City, the UN General Assembly special session on the world drug problem. And as much as we would like us to discuss in depth about what has been talked about in this session, we would rather open our eyes to a broader perspective. What have been the implications of what has been waged for over some decades now as the war on drugs? Has it been effective? What are the outcomes of prohibition? How have drug users been stigmatized through this? The imprisonment, the deaths, the violence that has occurred. And we will be discussing these with two guests today. One is yet to arrive, so I will present him when he does. And for now, we have Alex Russell, sorry about that. He's in France, but from the UK, who has very interesting perspectives and a personal account as well on this situation. So thank you, Alex, for being here.
Hi, Marlen. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you for being here. Also, he has been in previous Hangouts. We will share also links to the Hangouts we've had with him. So I'd like to begin with the discussion on the war on drugs itself and how much it has brought more problems, more suffering, where human rights have been violated and mostly affecting the poor people. I can give my personal account in Mexico and how there has been some numbers, outrageous numbers of maybe 250,000 people having been killed by this war that was waged by a particular president, Felipe Calderón, here in Mexico, leading to nothing else but absolute violence and a complete discontrol of our Mexican society. This problem has been a little bit slowing down at the moment. However, one can still say that Mexican, as many people say, is a narcocracy, or that our very own government is in cahoots with major cartels. There is also the involvement of governments in the drug trade in itself. It's not really a mystery that the CIA in the US has been directly involved in the trafficking of cocaine in deals with Mexico, Colombia. And what comes out of this is really questioning, what is it that we are really fighting? Are we really aiming at preventing drug use or disarming the cartels? Not at all. If anything, the weapon trade in Mexico has actually increased due to this drug war, so-called drug war. And of course, we can see that the outflows is that it hasn't worked at all. So, Alex, what do you say on this context of the war on drugs and its outflows and consequences? Has it worked?
Sorry, I was just trying to get a little increase in bandwidth there from my partner who's using the phone. Well, in terms of, if I understand what you're asking correctly, what has and hasn't worked in terms of the current approach to as we call it, the war on drugs, can, in a lot of ways, can be mirrored in other forms of prohibition that we've seen in the past. For example, prohibition of alcohol in the United States. So it's basically been about taking a very, very tough line with regards to just the trade in drugs, the production and distribution, but also in terms of actual individual users. So there's been really quite harsh punishments in most countries for drug users, as well as there have been drug dealers and manufacturers and suppliers on the large scale, which has obviously ended up in a situation where there are lots and lots of people who ended up with prison sentences and have been incarcerated as a result, through arguably nothing other than taking part in a recreational activity often, because we have to, make a distinction between drug abuse and drug use, although that's, it's a debatable point, and it could be regarded as a bit of a hazy distinction sometimes, but nevertheless it's there. Yeah, in terms of really the approach so far, it's it's been, as I say, it's been very hardline. It's very punitively focused, and it's taking the kind of approach of trying to eradicate drugs from our society by effectively putting the blinkers on ourselves and trying to ignore the problem, and whenever we're confronted with it, meeting it with a kind of very aggressive attitude, and somehow hoping that as such it'll go away.
There is also an interesting debate in this topic, generally speaking, when we look at all the movements for legalization, for especially cannabis, weed, marijuana. There is an ongoing approval in our society for it. However, there is also another alternative, which is decriminalizing. We definitely stand more with the use of the process of decriminalization because of what you were mentioning, how people are being imprisoned just by the use of drugs, trading of drugs, and who are those that are marketing drugs such as marijuana and others are mostly poor people that cannot afford having a better living in another kind of job, or because it is perceived as easy money, for example. So when we look at who benefits in this imprisonment, which is part of what is violating human rights as well, because you can tell us about what is going on in prisons as well in terms of labor and so forth, but this imprisonment is what is, from my perspective, and how the current system operates, specifically in the US, it is driving a lot of people to think that, well, they are criminals, they need to be locked up, without looking further into what is causing them to become drug dealers to begin with. Is it really about going to prison in a way to rehabilitate people? What do you say on this imprisonment to people?
To give just a personal perspective on this, a few years ago I spent a little bit of time working for a charity that was working directly with prisoners in the UK who were coming towards the end of their sentence. The charity was set up to try and develop practical work skills for a lot of these guys, so that when they left prison they wouldn't be in a position where they had no opportunities to find work and would then very quickly end up in prison. But that aside, there was still some drug use that I noticed taking place in prisons, although it's a very cagey and not often spoken about subject. And I certainly personally knew many people who had been put in prison specifically for drug possession offences. So really, in terms of the effectiveness of that, I can say in a general sense that actually it doesn't work. Taking away somebody's freedom only, using that as a kind of punishment for them making a personal choice effectively, doesn't really change anything, really, particularly if there's no education that goes along with that to actually support the people in question to become better informed, to make better choices, and to understand the context of drugs, perhaps in a wider, in a broader way. As you were saying, in terms of the relationship between the prohibition, the current legal status of drugs and the scheduling of drugs and the prison system, certainly we could argue that, for example, in the United States, where there are increasingly private prisons that are run for profit, that it actually benefits a lot of the corporations that own and run these prisons that use the prisoners as effectively slave labor to produce goods and services for free or for very, very little money, thereby cutting their production, their operating costs massively, that it's in their interests to actually keep people coming into prisons on a regular basis because they want the staff, effectively. So there is, in a sense, already within, even without looking at the black market for drugs and the drug cartels themselves, there is a legitimate corporate interest in maintaining the current state of prohibition because it enables them to access a workforce that they wouldn't even necessarily to be able to access as cheaply if they were, for example, shipping jobs over to seas to countries where they could get labor cheaper. I mean, that labor is even cheaper than that. So I think that's a really important point to recognize, although it isn't necessarily possibly one of the prime factors that's actually motivating the way that prohibition is continued.
It isn't, I agree, but it's very important to bring these kind of discussions to the front, whereas if we only focus on what the UN is bringing forth, many of these links obviously are not going to be presented. So what we are doing is precisely linking it to this socio-economical context. If we look at the war trade, of course, war trade, yes, because there's a lot that obviously a minority earns by manufacturing, trading weapons for the sake of keeping this war on drugs, which is more about the military-industrial complex, if anything, and taking control of certain countries. If we look at the Afghanistan situation, yes, their society is largely addicted. But many people say, well, yeah, they have a lot of poppy plantations, which actually the US has taken care of and control of. Kids in Afghanistan are trading opium, and they actually steal it for the sake of getting some money. So it is really far-sighted when we only look at the drug problem as a point of addiction, for example, which is more in the psychological aspect, which we will discuss a little bit later. But in this sense of decriminalization and legalization, what's your perspective on the difference between these two aspects?
Well, essentially, decriminalization is a situation where you remove the punitive measures, particularly, I would say, with regard to users of drugs, individual users or people who perhaps don't deal drugs on a large scale as a profit-making business, as their sole income, but actually kind of distribute drugs on a small scale as more of a social interaction. And I know that does take place because I've experienced that firsthand as I was growing up as a teenager. So decriminalization effectively removes the fear of prosecution and imprisonment for people who are using drugs and participating perhaps on the lower rungs of the drugs trade, as I say, not as a source of major income, but as essentially, I suppose you could say, as a way of getting cheaper drugs themselves and also kind of being part of a social scene. Legalization is different in that it removes all barriers to the drug industry in terms of legality or threat of prosecution, and that potentially opens the drugs trade up to free market capitalism. Now, what that means is that, on the one hand, it means that potentially there is a situation where we could wrest control of drug distribution and production from the drug cartels, from violent people who will use any violent means at their disposal to maintain their hold over a particular trade, a particular source of income for them. And it would also potentially give a government an opportunity to better ensure quality of drugs that are being distributed, so that there reduces the chance of people actually buying off the street and potentially buying substances which aren't what they're thought to be and could do them a lot of harm, and perhaps even kill them in the process of them trying to just get high to get their fix regarding on whatever drug it is, you know. It's interesting that, in fact, I remember a time, maybe a few decades ago, back in London, where the radio in London would often announce when a tainted batch of heroin, not that I was a user myself, but I heard about this from other people, and a tainted batch of heroin would be released onto the street, and people started dying as a result, and the radio in London would actually announce this to make people aware. So it's interesting that in some way, even though it was illegal at the time, there was a service being provided by people who recognized how dangerous this was. But there's another point on the issue of legalization, and that is that we are recognizing more and more these days that actually even our governments are not exempt from in any way the potential for corruption. And so legalization opens up also the possibility that governments working with corporations, big corporations, as we know that they already do to secure monopolies on certain industries, could do exactly the same thing with drugs production and distribution. And that this could in turn, through that mechanism, be further used and implemented as a tool for social control. So in that context, legalization just on its own as an open kind of open sesame to the drugs market perhaps shouldn't be considered without considering the potential for exploitation even by governments themselves.
I absolutely agree on that position. I've talked about it before as well when talking about decriminalization of drugs, legalization, and this aspect wherein, how I called it very bluntly maybe, from the Mexican cartel, for example, which is the criminal gang, that, as it is portrayed, which is just people that found that way to make money easier, better, and with more power, so to speak, going to or passing the business to the other cartel, which in many cases are the same governments, as it is happening here in Mexico, the US, as I mentioned in the beginning. And yes, I definitely invite people to investigate these, because journalists have actually been killed for exposing this kind of information. That's also a very common aspect when dealing with this kind of information in relation to drug trade specifically. In Mexico, there has been over 64,000 people that have been affected overall. A journalist gets attacked in any way, either threatened or killed, every 1.2 days, meaning almost on a daily basis. This is happening, which is also why the information on how this corruption operates is not heard on mainstream media. So this is one aspect that I invite our viewers to further investigate on. But definitely, there also is the point of taxation. Many people say this is a great way to get the tax revenue up if drugs are legalized in this way. And I would say, yeah, that would be great if taxation is then used for something that is not to continue imprisoning people or just continuing to do harm to them with these drug policies, but rather to assist, to rehabilitate, to educate, to place that money as a living income, for example. And this is something that has been seen in Portugal, for example, that have decided to remove this ban on drugs, and they have had really positive effects. Some people say that it's not only because of decriminalization, but because they also implemented a guaranteed minimum income. So we're seeing kind of like so to speak, the equation for a solution, which is decriminalize, educate, provide a living income, reintegrate people into society, and you can see better results, more so than what is happening with the war on drugs. So there we have part of the equation in terms of the solutions. We have, oh, before I forget, I wanted to mention also on what you were talking about in relation to the UK. And there's been a proposal for a blanket ban on what are called research chemicals, legal highs in the UK this year. And through interviewing people, I realized that it is only a measure that will push people to go further underground to get the same drugs. It's not like they're going to stop getting high using this kind of drugs. They will go to the EU, find other way to get their drugs. And this is not going to sort out the problem, because when the government says this is no longer going to be allowed, we often tend to miss out the people that actually depend on those businesses at the same time. The same is happening here in Mexico when marijuana has been legalized, weed has been legalized in many states in the US, like Washington, Colorado, and others. Nowadays, Mexican people are no longer planting weed. What are they doing now? They're cooking meth in very clandestine manners, which means unsafe, unregulated, of course. And at the same time, a growing heroin market is opening up here in Mexico, which means prohibition doesn't work, legalization in that sense doesn't work, and the market will continue this way because there is also a demand. So we will be discussing this in terms of the demand. We have a series of questions, so let's get to them. So we have from Tormod Wittsten, he's saying, how does it help a drug addict that the drug is illegal? What happens with the addicted when drugs are illegal? How can we turn this around to benefit all, to make a best for all solution? What would you say to that, Alex? You're muted.
I'm muted. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm just going to have another quick read of the question just so that I'll make sure that I've got it clear. How does it help a drug addict? Well, I mean, of course, it doesn't help a drug addict or a drug user at all in any sense if a drug is illegal. What happens with addicts when a drug is illegal? They are forced to interact with the criminal world as a whole in order to get money to actually get hold of drugs. Many women, for example, with heroin habits find themselves drawn into prostitution as a way of supporting their habits. This is not uncommon in many, many places in the world, and not just with heroin, but with meth and other drugs as well. It can make life very dangerous for people. Ultimately, it can put them, and they can end up putting themselves in very compromising situations and very unhealthy situations. You know, it encourages people to, for example, take the risk of sharing works, sharing needles, if they're injecting drugs. This can cause obvious, you know, problems in terms of transmission of diseases and infections like HIV, hepatitis, which is both are actually increasingly on the rise now. Unfortunately, when we were getting to a point when we were starting to see the numbers of people affected by that start to drop, it's now rising again. How we can turn this around, it's ultimately that question of decriminalization, remove the stigma. And as much as there may be many people who see that situation from the outside and fear the fact that, you know, if we decriminalize drugs, then everybody, you know, the streets would be rife with drug users and addicts, etc. When we look at countries like Portugal, like Switzerland, where they've actually put into practice, we can see, and as many other people have noted as well, that in practice, on the ground, that does not happen. It just does not happen. We've actually seen in those countries, for example, a reduction in the amount of people using, you know, hard drugs, injecting drugs, and things like that, because treatment is offered in lieu of prosecution and incarceration. So, yes, initially, I think the decriminalization is a big step in actually assisting people to access the drugs that they may literally need because of them being already in a situation of addiction, that they can access them without so much risk to their personal safety or to their health. So yeah, I think that that's a really, really important step. Just on one point that I wanted to pick up that you mentioned about taxation, in regard to this, more perhaps in terms of legalization, but perhaps in decriminalization situations as well. If a government can you know, generate a source of income through taxing the sale of drugs and the distribution of drugs, that can be regarded from one perspective as being helpful in terms of the economy as a whole. It would generate extra income for an economy. However, and I think perhaps we'll come to this point maybe a little bit later on, what it's also doing, by the nature of capitalism such as it is, as being kind of very potentially predatory, is that there is an interest then to perpetuate or even increase the amount of money that can be generated in terms of that revenue. So it actually, the whole issue of treatment with a view to actually liberating people from their addiction becomes contentious at that point, because it means that it becomes contrary to the actual economic interests of the country. So then you have a paradox. So you've got to ask yourself in that context, you know, how honest, how sincere is my government? What are their motives and what are their guiding principles? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, and yes, in relation to, oh, can you mute yourself, please? Yes. So in relation to what we were mentioning about governments and how they have been mostly in cahoots, a lot of them in cahoots with the use of drugs, trade of drugs, illegal trade of drugs, here to clarify. This does make us question, well, if there is a lot of taxation that is gotten from the legalization of drugs, will they use it properly? And that is a big question mark. That's why, for example, in the context of living income, we propose if you are going to be providing a living income, every money that is gotten through taxation should be directed that way. The same with all the money that is currently being used for any war on drugs, to rather funnel it in the form of a living income, rehabilitation, reintegration processes, which also goes along with what Tormod was asking. How can we turn this around? It is precisely with prevention at the same time. Yes, I do agree that people, if there is a continuation of the use of drugs, for whichever reason, they at the same time can get proper psychological support, and also to ensure that they have sufficient money, a good livelihood in essence, so that their addiction is not linked to be in a disempowered position in society. That's very important. And as Johan Hari, also a journalist that has openly spoken about this kind of solutions, he has explained how people can go into Switzerland and with a doctor present, shoot heroin, yet as Alex was mentioning, completely safe, it is regulated, they ensure that there is a control to this, so that if a person decides, even with the information, with education, still has this addiction, that it can, in essence, be assisted in a way. Of course, this is not like what we would, I personally, probably you either Alex, that we would like the world to continue being hooked on drugs. The eventual position is precisely to understand why are we using drugs massively, and why have drugs become a massive driver in the society, in the economy itself. This is maybe less known, but it is part of the markets that are obviously circulating a lot of money around the world, and we don't get to know about that either. And talking about money and the legalization and legalization, we have a question from Jonathan Motz, and he's saying, what are the economic advantages of hemp and why is it illegal? So this is something that we were going to discuss with Harrison, who was going to be part of this hangout. But to say it the least, he says that he cannot attend this hangout because he has a tech problem. So in essence, hemp has been made the boogeyman that no one wants to talk about because of its benefits in terms of fuel, the use of fuel, the use of the same fabric, the use of hemp fabric, for example, the medicinal aspects as well. And it would put the oil industry out of business. We're talking about big money, big industry that simply could be debunked with the use of hemp. We're also looking at how in the purpose of how it is grown, it is much easier to grow at the same time than saying going to destroy the Amazonas because we want paper, for example. So all of these things that currently drive our economy, which doesn't make sense, we have a solution that is actually hemp, that is sustainable, that is completely easier to grow, that is cheap. And these would obviously debunk oil industries, textiles, medicines, and all of these. So why are we, as we usually say here, shooting ourselves in the leg? Do you have a comment on this, Alex?
Yes, sorry about that. I have to say that I'm in France, one of the countries with the least reliable internet service in rural areas. It sometimes happens. I have no idea what happened. It'll have to remain a mystery. But back on topic. Yes, I mean, I don't know whether you already mentioned this, but in terms of the history of hemp prohibition, it was an issue around corporate interests that felt threatened by hemp and its potential, because as you say, it's cheap to produce, particularly in the States. The cotton and paper industries were two in particular that campaigned and lobbied very, very hard for the prohibition of hemp. Even though during the Second World War in the UK, in Europe and in the US it was encouraged to be grown because it was a useful material and really helped the war effort, nevertheless there was still this campaign for prohibition because those certain industries felt threatened by it, and it was those interests that actually contributed to the making of films like the well-known Reefer Madness, which was a very, very alarmist early 20th century film about the dangers of marijuana, basically. But in terms of hemp and its uses industrially, its benefits to the economy, yes, in terms of its use as a material for making, for example, paper, textiles, it has a great deal of uses, and medically as well. It poses a massive threat to the pharmaceutical industry because we know that for thousands and thousands of years it has been used medicinally in the form that it grows naturally in the world, not necessarily in the form that it's now hybridized and made super strength. That's a different issue, but in its natural growing form it has been used medicinally as well as for producing materials of various kinds, and for producing food through the seed for a long, long time, thousands and thousands of years. There are increasingly more and more technical developments that are happening with hemp. For example, I've read recently about the development of batteries using hemp fibers, which are incredibly efficient, super efficient batteries, obviously made using a very, very cheap material. There has also been developments recently in the development of a material that is equal in many ways, both in terms of conductivity as a capacitor and also in terms of its strength, to graphene. Now, graphene is a very, very new material. For people that aren't aware of it, it's a single carbon molecule thick or atom thick layer of a material that is incredibly strong, incredibly durable, and incredibly conductive. However, it's one of, if not the most expensive materials on the planet. So using it on a large scale is still effectively unaffordable in the current economic system for pretty much anybody. Whereas hemp is cheap to grow, cheap to manufacture, and to turn into a material that actually does just as good a job in many, if not all, respects.
Yes, and definitely in a world that is begging for sustainability and ecological responsibility, hemp is something that we should really spread the word about. And to not necessarily link it to, oh, I support hemp because I want to smoke it. No, personally, I don't agree with the use of drugs in the sense of smoking marijuana, for example. I personally decide not to do it. However, this is more about realizing why a government, a policy can prevent us from using a material that is so useful, so effective, so cheap, and that anyone could benefit from. So thanks a lot, Jonathan, for bringing that subject onto the table. I ask our viewers to keep sending on questions, comments that you may have around this topic. Alex, I would like us to go into an aspect that you mentioned when we were discussing on this subject, which is, okay, I'll just read Jonathan's comment. He says, the pharmaceutical companies are just as deadly as drug cartels. They are both drug cartels, one legally and one illegally. Fully agree on that. And as Alex was mentioning, it is well known that big pharma could be affected by these. And I think that it is part of the subject, you know, how the war on drugs, on these illegal drugs, is waged, while forgetting that these so-called over-the-counter legal drugs are broadly used in the world, mostly in the US. A lot of money is raked from the use of these pharma drugs, which, from my perspective, are keeping people in this passivity, in this constant numbness that prevents them from even becoming active in terms of realizing, hey, what is keeping me depressed? Why do I feel like I need some support in this world? What is the real problem going on here? And this is where we are going now with our discussion in terms of the sickness of our society. Why are people taking drugs? Why has it become a normalcy? Either legal or illegal, both are drugs. I fully agree with Jonathan here. Thanks for your comment. So can you share with us a little bit about this, Alex?
Sure. Well, to kind of bridge through to that point, in a sense, what you were just talking about the threat to pharmaceutical companies, we're realizing more and more, I think, that pharmaceutical companies do not make money from people being well or people being cured. They make money by people being sick. So it is not in their interests at all to produce drugs which effectively make people healthy and well. Whereas what cannabis potentially presents in some instances medicinally is to actually either genuinely help and support people in managing illnesses or to contribute to curing them completely. And that's really where the threat lies, because it not only threatens to replace certain pharmaceutical solutions, but it also counters the whole, whether clandestine or not, functioning principle of the pharmaceutical industry, and that it actually supports sickness rather than wellness. Now, to go through then into the point of why people are actually taking drugs and looking, as you say, at the kind of sickness in our society, there's a wonderful quote which I find myself always coming back to by an Indian gentleman called Jiddu Krishnamurti, who said, and if I quote this right, hopefully I will, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Now what that means is that he's recognizing in that statement that there is something fundamentally wrong, fundamentally sick, unwell, unhealthy about the societies in which pretty much all of us in the world live now. And so by that rationale, if we are actually well adjusted and able to function effectively in a society that is morally, economically, socially, culturally unwell, unhealthy, then that is not actually a sign of our own genuine health, psychologically, physically, or in any other way. So looking at that point in terms of why people may, we can't necessarily generalize completely. There's no generalizing rule about this, but we could say that for a lot of people, one of the reasons why they take drugs could be, for example, as a way of escaping, a sort of escapism from what they recognize, even if only subconsciously, is a fundamentally sick society. That this is a way of kind of stepping out of that experience, or somehow kind of anesthetizing the subconscious pain or grief or despair that they may feel in living in a world that is so increasingly obviously corrupt and unhealthy, and yet at the same time they may feel that as individuals they can do nothing about. You know, they feel powerless to actually bring about change as individuals. This changes the more we actually connect with each other, the more that we actually connect with people, with each other, and understand that we have this common sickness in our society, and that in some way that we're all collectively participating in it and therefore perpetuating and creating it, that we can actually change it. But still, for individuals, given that this is a society that is based on principles that serve to alienate people from each other, to create division and separation, it's not really that unexpected that people would look for ways to help them manage those feelings that naturally arise out of living in a world like that. So, for example, if we look at one particular researcher, a guy called Dr. Gabor Mate, who has done some research into the causes of addiction and their relationship to drug addiction, for example, or any addiction for that matter. He has identified that addiction arises out of the experience of pain, whether physical or psychological or emotional, whether that's through previous life experiences or out of our experiences of ourselves and of the world now. And so he started to look, instead of looking at the root causes of drug addiction and looking at the issues around the drugs themselves, he started to ask his clients, his patients, what is the source of your pain? Where's that coming from? Why do you feel emotional or psychological or physical pain? Where's that coming from? And looking at that as a potential cause as to why people would be using substances to try and help them deal with that pain, which, when you look at it, actually makes a lot of sense. There were methods that he went on to explore and use, like the use of ayahuasca as a way of actually dealing with this whole process of addiction, which, having experienced that, not having done it firsthand, but having seen the culture around ayahuasca firsthand in terms of the modern culture around it when I was in Colombia a few years ago, I would possibly disagree with, because I saw young people who were using what is supposedly a sacred and rarely or occasionally used substance, which is incredibly powerful in terms of the experience. They were using it on a almost daily basis, and that just seemed utterly ridiculous. And these were kids in their 20s, really, young people in their 20s, and so they weren't really using that, that experience as a transformative experience that was going to have, in one experience of it, a transformative impact upon them. It almost fell into the kind of pattern of addiction or use or abuse as well. So I'm not sure that I would necessarily advocate the same approach as he is currently exploring. But nevertheless, I think that his interpretation and his way of looking at the causes of addiction, in terms of our world as a whole and the way society functions, are sound.
I agree on that aspect. I mean, can you mute? Yeah. We have definitely a world that not many people are waking up happy to live in. Right. So there is a way to cope with it that drugs are used for. But I do, and I guess that you fully agree here, that when you find yourself with this loss of meaning, loss of purpose in our lives, the only thing that is left, and what I would recommend people doing, which is something that I did myself, is to precisely repurpose your life, repurpose yourself to do something that is geared toward changing the way things are now, and make that your motivation to live, and not just making your motivation to wake up and get high, for example, in any form or in any way. Because if we all keep subduing ourselves into the realm of drugs, to cope with this reality, this bridge that drugs could provide at certain stage in our lives becomes a constant, and then a business, and then this ball of consequences that we've been discussing throughout this Hangout. So I would mostly like to see how, if we decriminalize, if we provide a living income, a basic income to people to have a dignified living and proper support, psychological support, if creating a sound, healthy society could still lead people to resort to drugs. I would say no, because if you find yourself with the economic, financial ability to do that which you want to do in this world, and you see other people doing the same, you are pulled by that to be creative, to be, in essence, of purpose toward a better outcome in this world, which I think that we are all craving for. But as Alex mentioned, it's very important to not be downgraded in the sense of, I cannot do it, I cannot change how things are, therefore I just rather subdue myself, I rather get high and get lost and evade my reality or cope with it. So this is something that I would say is part of the solutions that we see, and that will take a process. It is so that what the UN was proposing in terms of having a drugs-free world sounds very unrealistic. It's not going to happen by 2020 nor later. I would say that it's not about drugs, making drugs the problem. It's about the relationship that we create with drugs and why we resort to them, and helping people out with money, with support, with creating a sound society that we really want to live in. We have a comment from, question from Sylvie Jacobs. She's saying, to place getting high in a perspective, what is the difference to people getting high on feelings of the mind? Isn't that an addiction as well? Do you have a comment on that, Alex?
Yes, I would agree. I would agree. There was an interesting documentary a few years ago called What the Bleep Do We Know? And it looked at the potential for us, for our minds, to become addicted to particular patterns of thinking, particular emotions, particular neural pathways, and expressions of brain chemistry, effectively, to become chemically addicted to our own thoughts, feelings, and emotions. I would agree this is entirely possible. So, for example, if we take the New Age movement, the light workers and the rainbow warriors of this world, yes, there is a potential there to become addicted to the idea of feelings of joy or love or light or whatever, and we can see, if we really look at the New Age movement, how a lot of people within that kind of way of thinking and looking at things will try to only focus on those things which they want to see in the world, those things which they want to hear, and they'll kind of try to block out everything else, which is ultimately still the reality of what's existing in this world. So you could argue that actually in doing that, they're effectively not really participating effectively in the world. They're not being realistic, and the same is true with anybody who focuses on a particular because generally speaking, let's say people are going to want to or try to or may become addicted to what they deem to be good feelings, positive feelings. So generally speaking, I would imagine, apart from the Satanists and so on and so forth. So they're not being realistic. They're not actually looking at the world and what is really happening. So for example, when we look at the relationship between the drugs trade and the arms trade, when we're looking at this particular instance, and how the two flow between each other, as you said, in Afghanistan, the trade in opium and everything, it increased exponentially when the war in Afghanistan with the Americans was going on, strangely enough, so there's a definite coherent link between the drugs trade and the arms trade. And just to bring in a point which I noted down shortly before the Hangout as I was considering this, in terms of the whole issue of legalization and decriminalization of drugs, and how that can have a relationship to the manifestation of war as well in the world. It's actually effectively the prohibition of drugs creates a war for drugs. It actually perpetuates the violence that goes around drugs, including war to some respects as well. I mean, the British fought an opium war. Let's remember history and realize how long this has been a part of the whole war economy and war machine. It ties in very closely. So similarly, a war on terror actually creates a war of or for terror. So just as legalizing or decriminalizing drugs creates a potential for the war on drugs, to end the war on drugs, and thus to end the war for drugs, by legalizing similarly, or decriminalizing, or a better put, I suppose, mandating something like peace, then just as you would with drugs, by removing the stigma around that, by creating a society that isn't focused economically or driven by war as the main kind of economic money generator, they're actually reorientating it around peace in terms of internal countries' policy towards its own citizens, and also foreign policy, that we're actually able to effectively end the situation of perpetual war as well. So the two are so closely related, and they really tie into how our society functions as a whole. The principles by which because we could argue that it's people do argue that it's capitalism that is to blame for the ills in our world and in our society, and we could say that yes, potentially that's true because capitalism can be predatory, but effectively we do not really have a situation of really free market capitalism in the world. It does not exist. We still effectively live in a feudal system where the wealth and all of the resources and the access to those are primarily controlled by an elite few, a very, very small number of people in the world, what we might call the 1% now. Whereas the remaining 99% have very little, if sometimes none, of the access that they need to resources, to money, to actually live a dignified life.
Yeah, we definitely need a social recovery in general. And what we would like to also bring through now that we have you here is if you can, and also to finalize the Hangout, share your perspectives, what you have lived throughout also the use of drugs, what you have realized, and your current stance in relation to it in a very personal level, if you're up for sharing.
Yeah, sure, I don't mind at all. Okay, so the first illegal drug I ever tried was cannabis, and that was when I was 15 years old. I'm now 40, so I have actually been using cannabis on a regular basis for more than half my lifetime, which it has run up until not too long ago, really, and I don't anymore. So that really blew me away when I looked at it from that perspective, and I think that was part of the reason why I really started to reevaluate my relationship with cannabis and drugs as a whole. From using cannabis, I went to using LSD. And it's not something that I'm proud of, but practically speaking, I've probably done more LSD than most people would do in 100 lifetimes. I mean, I did a lot, really, mostly during my teens. I was growing up in the sort of early 90s in the UK when the rave scene was really kind of in full swing. So naturally, drugs like amphetamines and ecstasy were very, very commonplace in those kind of social circles that I was in. In terms of the decision, why I actually kept on doing it, why I did it for so long, or why I started in the first place. As a child, I was always quite a sensitive little boy. I would pick up on a lot of things. I would kind of subconsciously feel a kind of sense of responsibility for the things that were happening around me. I was very kind of emotionally sensitive, and added to that, through no fault of their own, my parents had to kind of move us around as a family at different points as I was growing up, as a child, as a young teenager, which meant that I had to change schools. I had to change the towns that I was living in. I constantly had to leave behind my social group, my peers, my friends, and move to places or situations, whether schools or different localities, where I had to then meet a whole new group of people, had to try to fit into a whole group of friends that had generally often known each other for a much longer time than I'd known any of them. And this was really challenging. It was seriously really difficult, and I think that I found that quite destabilizing in a lot of ways. And so when I was in my early teens and I moved to an area where I met a group of people my age who had, some of them already started experimenting with drugs, and I was introduced to cannabis through one of those people, that I found it as a way of not only anesthetizing or allaying my own sense of apprehension or self-consciousness, my lack of self-esteem or self-confidence, but also as a way of finding some kind of social acceptance within that peer group. And so that kind of was perpetuated throughout my teenage years, and after enough years of really kind of getting used to that kind of behavior, that kind of scene, it kind of becomes normal, and that it did for me. And so from using the kind of party drugs and still using cannabis all of this time. Cocaine started to become a much more popular drug in the UK. At one time, the European Union noted it that the UK was the cocaine capital of Europe, and I was certainly a part of using that. I tried some opiates and pharmaceutical drugs recreationally sometimes as well, and tried to a limited degree some of the what they call the kind of research drugs. So things like 2CB and 2CI, which are a little bit like ecstasy in terms of their effects. So I've had a long history of using drugs of all various different kinds, but cannabis has kind of been the most constant throughout all that time. And it wasn't just the realization that actually I'd been using cannabis for more than half my lifetime that really woke me up to it. It was also the realization that where I had allowed myself to fall into this way of thinking that it was actually supporting me, I was beginning to realize that it actually wasn't. What it was doing was, rather than helping me kind of manage and deal with my emotions and my feelings better, it was just suppressing them. It was just burying them deep down in my subconscious. And when I stopped using cannabis, and I've tried several times, I've stopped and started again several times, and when I stopped, I noticed that all of the emotions that I'd suppressed and had been buried down within my subconscious suddenly started coming out, magnified, amplified, big time. And that was an incredibly powerful and really overwhelming experience. I had, at one point, a nervous breakdown because the sheer intensity of the emotions that were coming out, that because they'd been suppressed many years before, I no longer had the historical context to relate directly to them, or why they were coming up, or what they were caused by. So I had nowhere to place these emotions, and yet they were coming out. So that's something that I would really say when talking about cannabis, and I have done as a youth worker in my past. I've talked about this to people and explained that although cannabis is regarded as one of the least harmful drugs, like any substance which changes our perception and changes the way our brain is functioning in a chemical sense, we have to approach these things with caution. Particularly now that, for example, with cannabis, we have a form of cannabis which is commonly used, which, as I said before, is hybridized. It has a much higher THC, tetrahydrocannabinol content, which is the psychoactive part of the drug, than it does CBD, cannabidiol, which is the painkiller part of the drug, which you can't get high from. Now, in naturally growing cannabis, in the way that it's grown for thousands of years on this planet, it has a balance between the THC and the CBD, which means that it doesn't have the same capacity to encourage, say, for example, the potential for schizophrenia or psychosis that modern hybridized weed can, because it has so much emphasis on the strength of the psychoactive part, if that makes sense. So, yeah, it's been a powerful experience coming through that, walking through that, and I'm still walking through it. I still consider myself now going through, being in recovery effectively, because you have to walk that path for quite a while before you can be sure of yourself, before you can prove to yourself that you can actually stand in that and remain, in that point of integrity, that you don't have to fall back into that old pattern of addiction. You have to consistently prove that to yourself over time. But I've noticed in the time now since I've stopped using it that I'm able to manage my emotions much better, much more quickly. I'm able to kind of respond to and manage emotions as they arise. Anger is still one that I'd obviously repressed for a long time, so I'm still working with that a lot, and that's going to take a lot of work, but it's something that I walk through every day, and I find new ways to approach and better ways to deal with and to also release effectively every day. So I will write about it, I will look at the things that I've written, and I will take the opportunity to forgive myself for that, because for me that's really one of the most effective ways that I can actually release those emotions and move forward and walk forward in my life. So that's really where I'm at now. That's been my history of it, and yeah, I'm moving on from here, and it's actually now I'm in a position where I'm better able to use those experiences constructively to eventually, in the work that myself and my partner are moving forward, the project that we're hoping to set up as one aspect is to help to support people who are also going through similar experiences, to enable both ourselves and other people to effectively transcend that and to become more effective, more capable human beings.
Absolutely cool. Thank you very much for sharing that, and to be an example as well in terms of how you can repurpose your life once that you realize these things, which is a very personal process. We're sharing it here as an option that many people can take as well as an example, and we will for sure be talking about this project later on when it's up and running in some time, because it sounds very important in terms of social recovery. So thank you very much, Alex, for also being an informed person in relation to this topic. And I would also add to all of our viewers that may still use drugs, for example, to consider how our own consumption is creating the demand for drugs in this world, to rather consider what Alex has shared in terms of the reasons why we use drugs, and push yourself to see if you are able to live without them as well. Thank you very much, Alex, for being here.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, Marlen.
Equally so. And to our viewers, thank you very much. If you have any further questions, comments for Alex, share them in the comments section, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.